Canada Post is on strike. Again. What does it mean for us now? And what does it mean for the future of Canada Post? Let's get into it. So recently, the Mark Carney government announced that they were giving the go-ahead to Canada Post to stop doing door-to-door delivery. And this comes as part of a big plan to rejuvenate Canada Post and hopefully get them back to profitability. They plan to end door-to-door mail delivery, they plan to close multiple post offices, and they hope to make all neighborhoods rely on community mailboxes. If you already live in the suburbs, depending on where you are, you might be used to the community mailboxes, the ones you have to walk a couple minutes to down the street to go grab your mail and your flyers and all the other junk that shows up in your mailbox. But there's so many people in rural Canada that rely on door-to-door delivery. They don't have a 2-minute walk to the nearest communal mailbox because they expect it to be delivered to their houses. It's easy for city folk and suburban folk to not consider rural Canadians. I'm guilty of it too. I think most people are because they don't realize just how many Canadians are rural and how many of them still rely on door-to-door mail delivery. In fact, 4 million Canadians still rely on door-to-door mail delivery. While yes, it's technically seen as a corporation, its role in Canadian society isn't much different from a public library, public education, police services, fire departments, in the sense that it fulfills a service that many Canadians need and still use today. Public education makes it possible for young children to get educated. Libraries make it easier to access plenty of different programs. The fire department, police services, etc. These public goods are beneficial for Canadians. Canada Post fills the same role. The only difference is that, technically as a corporation, it's expected to be profitable. As a result of this desire for profitability, it's led to these massive overhauls. In fact, Canada Post hasn't been profitable since 2017. 2017. Since then, it's been operating at a loss. And in 2024, that loss hit a record number of $841 million. It operated at a loss of $841 million. Sounds like a big number. It is, but when you consider how much money is being spent on public education, libraries, police services, we're not expecting them to turn profit, because that's not their goal. They fill the role of providing a good for Canadians, but Canada Post doesn't operate on that same principle. The thing is, Canada Post workers don't support this. In fact, that's why they've gone on strike for the second time in the past year. This time, the union's main goal is to get a public mandate for these changes, rather than the government and the corporation making the decision on behalf of workers and Canadians. The union believes that it should be workers and Canadians who make the decision. Regardless of whether or not you support these policies, when there's 4 million people that still use home delivery, it's a reasonable expectation that it'll be a public mandate rather than a very select few people in government or the corporation making the decision. From my perspective, I think it's important that we keep Canada Post as a federal institution rather than as a corporation that operates for profit. I also think it's important that we make sure we understand the workers' perspective of this. They're not the ones to blame for these massive overhauls, they're simply protesting it. The thing that sucks is it leads to Canadians getting the short end of the stick because the protest interrupts typical mail flow. That was a big issue last year when Canada Post went on strike during holiday season. But the thing is, protests don't work unless they're at least a little bit disruptive. If you simply say we don't approve of this, the likelihood of the government listening is pretty low. But when you get in the way and you try to disrupt the way the system works, it tends to make changes, and it tends to make it a big deal, so that's what the workers did. A lot of people don't want to understand why the strike is happening. They blame the workers, say that it's ridiculous, and dismiss their perspectives without realizing that they're doing it for a long-term benefit for themselves and for Canadians. If we lose door-to-door delivery with Canada Post, That is the first pillar knocked down in an already fragile postal system in the country. Personally, I don't want to have to rely on the big parcel deliverers to take care of my mail. I want to trust Canada Post. I want to know that no matter what, I can rely on them to deliver my mail. But the precedent that's being set by the end of door-to-door delivery is frightening. And it's easy to dismiss that and not see it as a big deal if it doesn't impact you. I get it. The thing is, when you start to lose these important key operating pieces of a postal system, it starts a domino effect. When it comes down to it, they need to make more profit. They'll likely cut back on other services. They'll close other postal offices, especially in rural areas. They'll make the community boxes bigger, but fewer. You'll have to walk further or drive further to pick up your mail. It'll be a lot more of a pain and a hassle to get mail, and it'll just lead to Canada Post failing in the long term. When it's more convenient to send an email, a text, or a phone call, why would people want to use a postal service that's struggling so much? It's unreliable, it's failing, and they're scaling back in such large, drastic ways that hurt Canadians. Find alternate ways to cut costs rather than cutting services to cut those costs. Politicians today want to choose what is easiest because it doesn't matter to them. No matter what, they're not going to feel the impact of these policies. If they scale back on more post offices, make the community mailboxes bigger, fewer, and further between, it's not going to influence them at all, because they don't understand the Canadian experience, and they don't want to. Your only option for mail and packages is either Canada Post or one of the massive mail package delivering giants that already exist, and none of them have your best interest at heart. So what are Canadians supposed to do? Yes, some things will lose money, but when it's a good for the Canadian public, especially one as important as Canada Post, how can you support making it less accessible? Privatization of things is a conversation for another day. We don't need to go into every single form of privatization and which ones are good or bad, but I think it's pretty easy to agree that having mail delivered shouldn't be something that Canadians have to sacrifice for corporate gain. We're in a cost of living crisis right now where nobody can afford anything, whether it's gas for their cars, rent for their apartments, their groceries, even it seems getting mail. Everything is becoming harder to access and it's becoming more expensive to access because corporations just want to profit. How does that help anyone? Can it help anyone? I don't think so. I think it's hard for anyone to believe that it's a good move on the government's part, if they truly want to see it as a corporation, to get involved. If you're going to treat it as a company, then yeah, let them prioritize their profits, but don't be getting involved as a federal government entity telling them what to do. Because then it leads to this mess of a situation where the government and the corporation are screwing over workers and Canadians, and there's nothing that we can do about it other than simply share our frustration. Regardless of how you feel about Canada Post, maybe you think they do need to operate for a profit, maybe you like these changes, but when this is the second time in the past year, less than a year, that Canada Post has gone on strike, you need to wonder, what is our government doing wrong with handling our postal service? Regardless of how you feel about Canada Post, regardless of how you feel about these policies, you need to agree that it's not fair that Canadians are left screwed over because the government doesn't know how to handle a postal service. This is an issue, and it's going to keep happening when the government does not listen to workers or Canadians on a regular basis. We keep being ignored. Workers keep being ignored. And then we are left suffering the consequences when the workers have to stand up for themselves. The workers take the blame, meanwhile it's the government at fault for not doing their damn job. Those are my thoughts on it. I think it's shameful that Canadians are being screwed over, but I also don't think we need to blame the workers. I have no clue how long this strike will last. It could last for another 2 days, it could last for another 2 months. I don't know, and it depends how firm the union stands on this. And it also depends how firm the government stands. We'll have to watch, but I'm not too optimistic. Because, if anything, what this government has shown us is that they will let everyone down, time and time again. Elbows up, everyone.